The moment the narrative begins to collapse, begins with a shift that often happens quietly at first, almost unnoticed, before the full impact becomes visible. For a long time, there may have been a version of your story circulating among certain people, a narrative about your private life that slowly took on a life of its own. Stories like this often grow in environments where information is incomplete and emotions fill the gaps left by uncertainty. Someone shares an interpretation, another person adds their perspective, and over time, the original situation becomes distorted into something that no longer fully reflects reality. During this period, you may have chosen not to engage in constant explanations or public defenses of your character. To some observers, that silence may have been misunderstood. People sometimes assume that if someone does not immediately respond to rumors or speculation, they must have something to hide. But silence can also represent a different kind of strength. It can be the decision to step away from unnecessary drama and allow time to reveal what words alone cannot immediately correct. While the narrative continued circulating, you may have been observing quietly, aware that truth has a way of resurfacing when the right moment arrives. That moment appears to be unfolding now, because someone who understands the situation more clearly has begun setting the record straight. This person is not participating in gossip or speculation. They are simply introducing clarity where confusion once existed. Their honesty is beginning to shift the conversation in a direction that reflects what actually happened, rather than what people assumed happened. As this new clarity spreads, the atmosphere surrounding your story is changing. People who once relied on second-hand information are beginning to reconsider what they believed. At the same time, the individual who benefited from the earlier narrative, an ex who may have shaped or reinforced those rumors, is reacting strongly as the situation begins to unravel. The tension you are witnessing now is not random. It is the natural result of truth entering a space that had been built on incomplete or distorted interpretations of your life. When silence was misinterpreted begins with a realization that many people only understand after time has passed. Because silence in difficult situations is often interpreted incorrectly by those who observe it from the outside. In environments where rumors spread quickly and emotions move faster than facts, people expect immediate responses. They assume that anyone who remains quiet must be hiding something, or lacks the ability to defend themselves. This expectation comes from a culture that treats reaction as strength and restraint as weakness. Yet the reality is often the opposite. True composure frequently appears in the form of silence. Not because the person has nothing to say, but because they understand that reacting to every accusation only fuels the very narrative that needs to collapse on its own. When you chose not to immediately confront the rumors about your private life, some individuals may have interpreted that quietness as confirmation of the story they were already telling themselves. The human mind naturally fills empty spaces with assumptions, especially when emotions or personal biases are involved. If someone already suspects something negative, your silence may have appeared to reinforce that suspicion. But what they did not see was the deeper awareness behind your decision. You recognized that entering a chaotic conversation filled with speculation would only multiply the noise. Every explanation could be twisted. Every defense could be reframed, and every reaction could become another piece of gossip circulating among people who were never interested in truth to begin with. In situations like that, speaking too soon does not correct the narrative. It often strengthens it. By remaining quiet, you removed yourself from the cycle of reaction that fuels misunderstanding. This kind of restraint requires a level of emotional discipline that many people underestimate. When rumors about your personal life circulate, the instinct to defend yourself can feel overwhelming. Most individuals want to immediately correct the record, confront the person spreading the story, and demand that everyone see the situation from their perspective. That instinct is understandable because reputation and dignity matter deeply in human relationships. But reacting impulsively can trap someone in a conflict that never actually resolves the issue. Instead of bringing clarity, constant defense can keep the story alive longer than it would otherwise survive. Every explanation becomes another chapter in a narrative that thrives on attention. By refusing to participate in that cycle, you allowed something important to happen. Time began doing the work that argument alone could never accomplish. Rumors have a unique weakness that becomes visible only when enough time passes. They struggle to maintain consistency. When a story is built on incomplete information or emotional interpretation rather than observable reality, contradictions eventually begin appearing. Details shift depending on who repeats the story. Explanations become more complicated as people attempt to fill the gaps. Eventually, the narrative becomes so tangled that even those who once believed it begin sensing that something does not fully align. Your silence created the space necessary for those contradictions to reveal themselves. Without your voice constantly reacting to the accusations, the story had to stand on its own. And when a narrative stands alone without constant reinforcement, its flaws gradually become visible. The individuals who initially accepted the rumors may have begun noticing that certain elements did not add up. Perhaps different people repeated slightly different versions of the story. Perhaps new information surfaced that conflicted with earlier claims. Or perhaps your behavior simply did not match the image the rumor tried to create. Over time, these small inconsistencies accumulate until the narrative begins losing its credibility. This process is rarely dramatic or immediate. Instead, it unfolds quietly as people reconsider what they once believed. In the beginning, your silence may have seemed like absence, but in reality, it was a strategic presence. You were present through observation rather than reaction. You watched how the story evolved, how different individuals interacted with it, and how the environment responded to the absence of your participation. This perspective allowed you to see patterns that others could not see, while they were emotionally invested in the gossip itself. Observing instead of reacting gave you clarity about who was genuinely seeking the truth and who was simply enjoying the drama surrounding the rumor. That distinction becomes incredibly valuable over time because it reveals the difference between people who value understanding and those who prefer speculation. As the narrative continued circulating without your involvement, another subtle shift began taking place in how others perceived your silence. At first, some individuals may have questioned why you were not defending yourself more aggressively. But as weeks or months passed, your calm demeanor began standing in contrast to the emotional reactions surrounding the rumor. While others continued discussing the story, you continued living your life without displaying the desperation that usually accompanies guilt or fear. This contrast gradually reshaped how observant people interpreted your silence. What once looked like avoidance began appearing more like composure. Instead of a person hiding from accusations, they began seeing someone who refused to let rumors control their behavior. That difference may seem small, but perception shifts in powerful ways when people compare narratives to actual behavior. Human beings instinctively watch how someone carries themselves during periods of tension. If someone reacts with constant anger, panic, or defensiveness, observers may interpret those reactions as signs of instability. But when someone remains calm and continues moving forward without participating in chaos, the absence of reaction itself becomes meaningful. Your silence began telling its own story. It communicated that you were not defined by the narrative others were trying to construct about you. Instead of fighting for control over every conversation, You trusted that reality would eventually reveal itself. This kind of trust requires patience, because the process of truth surfacing is rarely immediate. Many people abandon their composure halfway through because they become frustrated waiting for the narrative to unravel. They eventually react out of exhaustion or anger, giving the rumor new energy at the very moment it was beginning to weaken. By maintaining your restraint, you allowed the process to continue without interruption. Over time, the same silence that was once misinterpreted began becoming evidence of your stability. People who watched closely realized that if the accusations were true, your behavior would likely reflect anxiety or defensiveness. Instead, they saw someone who remained steady despite the noise surrounding them. That steadiness forced observers to reconsider the original story. They began asking themselves a simple question. If the rumor were accurate, would this person really appear so calm? Questions like that slowly weaken the credibility of gossip, because they shift attention away from the story itself and toward the character of the person being discussed. Character is far more difficult to manipulate than rumor. While narratives can be invented and repeated endlessly, character reveals itself through consistent behavior over time. Your composure allowed your character to speak more loudly than any explanation could have. Eventually, the environment began reaching a point where someone who understood the situation clearly felt compelled to correct the narrative publicly. When that person stepped forward to set the record straight, the groundwork had already been prepared by your silence. If you had spent months arguing with every rumor, the truth might have been dismissed as just another defensive explanation. But because you remained calm and removed from the drama, the moment someone else spoke up carried greater credibility. Their words did not sound like an attempt to defend you. They sounded like an observation that aligned with what many people had already begun suspecting. In this way, the silence that was once misunderstood became one of the most powerful elements shaping the outcome of the situation. It allowed the truth to surface naturally, rather than forcing it into a defensive argument. What looked like passivity from the outside was actually discipline, patience, and strategic awareness. By stepping back instead of reacting, you allowed reality to reveal the flaws within the rumor itself. And now, as someone finally begins correcting the narrative about your private life, the contrast between the noise of gossip and the steadiness of your silence becomes impossible to ignore. How rumors about your life spread begins with something that many people underestimate until they experience it personally. Because rumors rarely start as dramatic fabrications. More often, they begin as small interpretations of events that slowly drift away from reality as they move through different voices and perspectives. A single comment, an incomplete observation, or a misunderstood interaction can become the starting point of a story that gradually grows larger than the original situation itself. Human conversations naturally reshape information as it travels from one person to another. Each individual who repeats the story adds their own emotional tone, personal assumptions, or partial understanding. Over time, the original event becomes almost unrecognizable because the narrative now carries layers of interpretation that were never part of the truth to begin with. In situations involving relationships, especially when an ex-partner remains emotionally invested in the past, this transformation can happen even faster. When emotions remain unresolved, people often search for explanations that protect their own sense of identity. Instead of admitting that a relationship ended for complex or mutual reasons, it becomes easier to construct a story that places responsibility entirely on the other person. This is where rumors often gain momentum. The story begins not as a calculated lie, but as a version of events shaped by personal frustration, hurt, or the desire to preserve one's pride. The X may have shared their perspective with friends or acquaintances who sympathized with their feelings. Those listeners then repeated the story to others, each time adjusting it slightly as they tried to make sense of the situation. With every repetition, the narrative gained new details, some exaggerated, and others invented unintentionally through assumption. Eventually, the story reached people who had no direct connection to the original relationship, but felt confident repeating what they heard because it had already circulated through multiple sources. This process illustrates one of the most fascinating aspects of rumor dynamics. The more a story travels, the more legitimate it begins to sound. Not because the information becomes more accurate, but because repetition creates the illusion of credibility. When several people repeat the same narrative, listeners assume there must be some truth behind it. Rarely do they pause to examine whether those individuals all received their information from the same unreliable source. Instead, they interpret the repetition as confirmation. This phenomenon is one of the reasons rumors can spread so quickly in social environments where communication happens informally. Conversations that feel casual can carry powerful influence over how someone's character or actions are perceived by others. Once the narrative about your private life began circulating in this way, it entered a network of conversations that continued evolving without your involvement. People who barely knew you may have formed opinions based on fragments of the story they heard from someone else. Those opinions then shaped how they interpreted your behavior whenever they encountered you. If someone already believed the rumor, even neutral actions might have been interpreted through that lens. A normal interaction could appear suspicious, and silence could appear like confirmation rather than restraint. This is how rumors sustain themselves. They create a filter through which every new observation is interpreted in a way that reinforces the existing narrative. The presence of an X within this dynamic often adds another layer of complexity. Relationships carry emotional history, and that history influences how people explain what happened after the relationship ends. An X who feels misunderstood, rejected, or hurt may unconsciously amplify certain details while minimizing others in order to present their version of events more convincingly. When they share that narrative with friends, those friends may repeat it out of loyalty or sympathy. Soon the story expands beyond the circle of people who were originally involved. Individuals who were never present during the events begin speaking about them as though they fully understand what occurred. The narrative becomes a social artifact rather than a reflection of reality. By the time it reaches wider audiences, it often bears only a faint resemblance to the truth that existed at the beginning. What makes this process particularly powerful is that rumors often thrive in environments where the person being discussed chooses not to respond immediately. Silence leaves space for interpretation, and those who enjoy speculation may fill that space with imaginative conclusions. At first, this might have appeared unfair, because the narrative about you was being shaped without your voice present in the conversation. Yet that same silence eventually revealed an important weakness in the rumor itself. Without direct confrontation from you, the story continued evolving freely, accumulating contradictions as different people repeated it in slightly different ways. Over time, these inconsistencies became difficult to ignore. People who heard multiple versions of the same story began noticing that the details did not match perfectly. One person described events differently than another. Certain explanations seemed exaggerated or emotionally charged. These discrepancies slowly eroded the credibility of the rumor. Even those who initially believed it may have started feeling uncertain about how much of it was actually accurate. This moment of doubt is often the beginning of the rumor's decline. Once listeners realize that the narrative lacks consistency, they begin paying closer attention to the behavior of the person being discussed. Instead of relying entirely on secondhand information, They observe how that individual carries themselves in everyday situations. In your case, the contrast between the dramatic narrative circulating about your life and the calm way you continued living began raising questions. If the rumors were entirely accurate, people expected to see signs of chaos, defensiveness, or desperation. Instead, they saw someone who remained steady, composed, and largely unaffected by the noise surrounding them. That difference gradually changed the way observers interpreted the story. The rumor that once sounded convincing began appearing exaggerated because it did not align with the person they were actually seeing. At the same time, the X who contributed to the narrative may have continued reinforcing it in an attempt to maintain control over the story. When someone becomes attached to a particular version of events, letting go of that narrative can feel like losing control of the situation entirely. As a result, they may repeat the same explanation repeatedly, even as others begin questioning its accuracy. Ironically, this persistence sometimes accelerates the collapse of the rumor because it highlights the emotional investment behind it. Listeners start recognizing that the story is being defended rather than simply explained. That realization prompts them to look for alternative perspectives. Eventually, someone who had clearer knowledge of the situation steps forward to share a more accurate version of events. When that happens, the rumor that once spread so easily begins losing its influence almost immediately. People who were already uncertain about the narrative now feel validated in their doubts. Conversations shift from repeating speculation to reconsidering what actually happened. The story that once traveled rapidly through informal discussions begins slowing down as the truth reorganizes how the situation is understood. This entire process reveals something important about the nature of rumors. They can spread quickly, but they struggle to survive once clarity enters the environment. The narrative about your private life may have moved through many voices and interpretations before reaching its peak. But every rumor eventually reaches a point where reality begins correcting it. That correction does not always happen through confrontation or dramatic revelation. Sometimes it happens simply because people begin noticing that the story does not match the person they are observing. In your case, the combination of your composure and the arrival of someone willing to speak honestly has created the conditions for that correction to begin. The rumor that once seemed powerful now faces the challenge of surviving in an environment where truth is finally entering the conversation. The unexpected person who spoke up begins with a moment that often arrives quietly but carries enormous weight. Because when rumors have circulated for a long time, people sometimes assume that silence will continue indefinitely. Stories grow comfortable inside that silence. They become part of everyday conversation, repeated so frequently that many individuals stop questioning where they originally came from. Yet in many situations, there is always at least one person who has observed the events more closely than the rest. This person may have remained quiet for a long time, not because they agreed with the rumors, but because they were watching, waiting, and trying to understand the full picture before stepping into the conversation. The arrival of this voice is often unexpected, precisely because it interrupts the rhythm of speculation that others had grown used to. In your situation, someone like this finally decided to speak. Their decision was not motivated by drama or the desire to create conflict. Instead, it came from a sense that the truth had remained hidden long enough, and that allowing the narrative to continue unchecked would only deepen the misunderstanding surrounding your life. People who step forward in moments like this rarely see themselves as heroes or defenders. They simply reach a point where remaining silent feels heavier than speaking honestly. Perhaps they witnessed parts of the situation that others never saw. Perhaps they recognized inconsistencies in the story being repeated about you. Or perhaps they understood your character well enough to know that the narrative circulating did not align with reality. Whatever their reason, the moment they spoke changed the direction of the conversation immediately. Until that moment, the rumor had traveled largely in one direction. Each retelling reinforced the same interpretation of events, and the absence of an alternative explanation allowed that interpretation to dominate the discussion. But when this person introduced a different perspective, the narrative suddenly encountered resistance. Listeners who had accepted the rumor without much thought now heard a version of the story that felt grounded in observation rather than speculation. The contrast between these two perspectives forced people to pause and reconsider what they believed. It is remarkable how quickly perception can shift when someone introduces clarity into a conversation that has been dominated by assumptions. The person who spoke up may have described specific details that had been overlooked or misrepresented. They might have explained the sequence of events more accurately or provided context that had been missing from earlier retellings. As they spoke, the structure of the rumor began losing its stability because the story that once seemed convincing could no longer explain everything people were hearing. This moment often creates a kind of quiet tension in the room or within the conversation itself. Those who had been repeating the rumor may feel surprised, uncertain, or even defensive as they realize that the narrative they believed might not be complete. Others may feel a sense of relief because the new explanation aligns with doubts they had quietly carried for some time. In environments where gossip is circulated freely, it only takes one credible voice to disrupt the entire structure supporting that gossip. The unexpected person who spoke up became that voice. Their presence altered the conversation, not through aggression, but through clarity. Instead of attacking the people who believed the rumor, they simply described what they knew to be true. That approach made their words difficult to dismiss because they were not fueled by emotion or accusation. They sounded like observations rather than arguments, and observations have a unique power when they resonate with reality. As the conversation unfolded, people began noticing how the new explanation connected details that previously seemed confusing. Events that once appeared suspicious suddenly made sense when placed within a more accurate timeline. Behaviors that had been interpreted negatively now looked different when viewed through the lens of context. Gradually, the listeners realized that the rumor had been filling gaps in the story with assumptions rather than facts. This realization did not necessarily happen all at once. Some individuals processed the new information immediately, while others required time to reflect on what they heard. But the direction of the conversation had already changed. The narrative was no longer controlled by speculation alone. Another fascinating aspect of moments like this is how they reveal the difference between those who value truth and those who prefer the comfort of a familiar story. When the unexpected person spoke up, some listeners leaned forward with curiosity, asking questions and trying to understand the situation more clearly. These individuals recognized that the new perspective offered an opportunity to replace confusion with knowledge. Others reacted differently. For them, the rumor had already become part of their understanding of the situation, and adjusting that belief required admitting that they may have been wrong. Human pride can make that admission difficult, so some people responded with hesitation or subtle resistance. They searched for reasons to dismiss the new explanation, or attempted to redirect the conversation back toward the narrative they were more comfortable repeating. Yet even resistance could not fully restore the old story once clarity had entered the discussion. The person who spoke up had introduced a perspective that aligned too closely with reality to be ignored indefinitely. The environment had begun shifting, and that shift continued spreading through the thoughts of everyone who heard the conversation. For you, this moment represented a turning point that had been quietly building for a long time. Your silence earlier allowed the rumor to expose its own weaknesses, and now someone else's honesty brought those weaknesses into the open. The two actions work together in a way that few people initially recognize. Your restraint prevented the rumor from gaining energy through confrontation, while the unexpected voice provided the clarity that listeners needed to reconsider the entire narrative. Together, these elements created the conditions for the truth to emerge naturally. It is important to recognize that the person who spoke up likely understood the weight of their words before they said them. Stepping into a conversation dominated by rumors can feel intimidating because it means challenging a narrative that many people have already accepted. Yet courage in moments like this does not require dramatic gestures. It simply requires the willingness to describe reality honestly, even when others might prefer the convenience of speculation. By doing so, this individual became the catalyst for a shift that had been waiting to happen. As their explanation circulated through the group, people began seeing your situation through a different lens. The rumor that once seemed convincing started appearing incomplete. The story that once moved easily through conversations now encountered questions it could not easily answer. The environment that had once amplified speculation began moving toward clarity. And as this shift continued, it became increasingly difficult for the old narrative to survive in the presence of a truth that explained the situation more accurately. The unexpected person who spoke up did not simply correct a rumor. They opened a door through which reality could finally enter the conversation. Why truth eventually disrupts false narratives begins with a principle that quietly governs nearly every human interaction, even when people are not consciously aware of it. False narratives require constant maintenance, while truth has a natural stability that eventually reveals itself through time. When a rumor spreads about someone's life, it often appears powerful in the beginning because it travels quickly through conversation and emotion. People repeat it because it sounds interesting, dramatic, or convincing in the moment. Yet beneath that surface momentum lies a hidden weakness. A false story depends on continued reinforcement from those who believe it. Each person who repeats the narrative must unknowingly protect it from scrutiny by avoiding questions that might expose its inconsistencies. As long as the rumor moves through an environment where curiosity is low and assumptions remain unchallenged, it can appear strong. But the moment clarity enters the discussion, the entire structure supporting that narrative begins to tremble. This is exactly what happens when truth finally disrupts the conversation. Truth does not always arrive loudly. Often it appears quietly through observation, through context, or through a single person willing to explain what actually occurred. And once that explanation enters the environment, listeners begin comparing it with the version of events they had previously accepted. The comparison alone starts revealing fractures within the rumor that people had overlooked before. A story that once sounded coherent suddenly begins to feel incomplete. Details that once seemed dramatic now appear exaggerated. Motives that once sounded logical begin raising questions. Gradually, the emotional certainty that supported the rumor begins dissolving. What makes truth particularly powerful in moments like this is that it does not require constant defense. It stands on its own because it aligns with observable reality. When someone describes events truthfully, their explanation naturally connects with the facts people can verify through experience. Listeners recognize this alignment even if they cannot immediately explain why it feels more reliable. They sense that the explanation fits the pieces of the situation more smoothly than the rumor did. This intuitive recognition begins shifting the atmosphere of the conversation. People who previously repeated the rumor may grow quieter as they process the new information. Others begin asking questions that explore the details more carefully. The environment slowly moves away from speculation and toward understanding. One of the most fascinating aspects of this shift is how it reveals the difference between emotional storytelling and grounded explanation. Rumors often thrive because they appeal to emotion. They highlight betrayal, scandal, or conflict because those elements capture attention quickly. Yet emotional narratives rarely hold together under careful examination because they rely on exaggeration rather than balance. When truth enters the conversation, it replaces drama with context. Suddenly, the situation appears more complex and more human than the rumor suggested. Instead of villains and heroes, there are simply individuals navigating circumstances that others misunderstood. This transformation can feel surprising to those who had become accustomed to the earlier narrative. They realized that the story they accepted was shaped more by imagination than by evidence. In your case, the arrival of truth began disrupting the narrative that had surrounded your private life. For a long time, that narrative moved easily through conversations because it was rarely challenged directly. People repeated it casually, assuming that if the story had circulated so widely, it must contain some accuracy. But once someone began explaining the situation more clearly, listeners started recognizing how much of the earlier narrative relied on assumption. Events that were once interpreted negatively began appearing neutral or even reasonable when placed within the correct context. Decisions that once seemed suspicious now looked like ordinary responses to circumstances that others had misunderstood. The rumor's emotional appeal faded as listeners realized that its dramatic tone had exaggerated the reality of what actually happened. As this realization spread, something else began changing within the social environment surrounding the story. The energy that once fueled the rumor began dissipating. Conversations shifted from repeating speculation to reconsidering the situation entirely. Individuals who had once participated in spreading the story might feel a mixture of embarrassment and reflection as they recognized how easily misinformation had traveled through their discussions. Some may attempt to correct themselves by sharing the new explanation with others. Others may simply stop repeating the rumor altogether, allowing it to fade quietly from conversation. In either case, the narrative loses its momentum because the emotional excitement that sustained it has been replaced by clarity. This process demonstrates why truth possesses such remarkable endurance over time. False narratives depend on constant repetition to survive, but truth requires only recognition. Once people understand what actually occurred, they no longer need to reinforce the explanation through endless retelling. It becomes the natural reference point for how the situation is understood. Even those who once believed the rumor may find themselves gradually adjusting their perspective because the accurate explanation fits reality more comfortably than the earlier speculation ever did. Observing this shift can feel deeply affirming for someone who endured the weight of the rumor without reacting impulsively. Your decision to remain composed while the narrative circulated allowed the truth to emerge without distortion. Had you responded aggressively or defensively earlier, the conversation might have become more polarized, giving the rumor additional energy through conflict. Instead, your restraint allowed the environment to reach a point where listeners were ready to hear a clearer explanation. When that explanation finally arrived, it did not sound like a desperate attempt to defend yourself. It sounded like the missing piece that completed the story. Another important dimension of truth-disrupting false narratives lies in the way it restores balance to how people perceive a person's character. Rumors often reduce individuals to simplified roles within a dramatic story. Someone becomes the problem, the villain, or the one who caused everything. These labels spread easily because they simplify complex situations into narratives that are easier to repeat. But once truth enters the conversation, those labels begin losing their power. People start recognizing the full context behind the events that occurred. They see the circumstances, the misunderstandings, and the emotional reactions that shaped the situation. Instead of a simplified character within a rumor, they see a real person whose actions make sense when understood properly. This transformation in perception does not always happen overnight. Some individuals require time to adjust their understanding because letting go of a familiar narrative can feel uncomfortable. Yet the shift continues unfolding gradually as more people encounter the accurate explanation. With each conversation that includes clearer context, the rumor loses another layer of influence. Eventually, the narrative that once seemed dominant becomes little more than an example of how easily misinformation can spread when people rely on assumptions rather than facts. What remains in its place is a more balanced understanding of the events that occurred. The story no longer revolves around speculation, but around the lessons people learned through observing how the situation unfolded. And perhaps the most significant lesson within this transformation is the realization that truth has its own quiet timing. It may take time to surface, especially when rumors initially capture attention through emotion and drama. But once it appears, it possesses a stability that false narratives cannot maintain. Over time, people naturally gravitate toward explanations that align with reality, because those explanations allow them to make sense of the world more accurately. In the end, the disruption of the false narrative surrounding your life did not occur through confrontation or force. It happened through clarity, patience, and the eventual arrival of truth in a conversation that had been dominated by speculation for far too long. Why your silence made the truth stronger begins with something that many people misunderstand in moments of conflict. Because when rumors circulate, or when others begin speaking about your private life in distorted ways, the natural instinct is often to react immediately. The human mind wants to correct the record quickly, defend personal dignity, and push back against narratives that feel unfair or misleading. Yet history, psychology, and even everyday social dynamics show that immediate reaction does not always strengthen truth. In many cases, it actually gives the rumor additional oxygen, turning a quiet misunderstanding into a louder and more dramatic conflict. This is why silence, when used intentionally rather than out of fear, can become one of the most powerful responses a person has available. Your silence during the earlier stages of this situation was not weakness. It was a form of discipline that allowed events to unfold without interference from emotional escalation. While others were speaking, interpreting, and repeating their versions of the story, you chose not to jump into the middle of every conversation, attempting to control how people perceived you. That restraint created space for something important to happen. The rumor had to stand on its own, without your reaction fueling it. When rumors encounter resistance immediately, they often transform into debates where both sides appear equally defensive. Observers who witness those debates sometimes assume that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, even when one side is far closer to reality than the other. Silence interrupts this dynamic because it removes the spectacle of confrontation that rumors thrive upon. Instead of becoming a dramatic public argument, the situation remains relatively quiet, allowing listeners to evaluate the narrative more carefully over time. In your case, this quiet presence allowed people to observe you directly, rather than through the lens of the rumor alone. They saw how you continued living your life without desperation, without constant explanations, and without attempts to chase every conversation that mentioned your name. That behavior slowly began raising questions in the minds of those who were paying attention. If the stories circulating about you were completely accurate, people expected to see signs of agitation or defensive behavior. Yet what they witnessed instead was someone who remained steady and composed. That contrast between the rumor and your behavior became its own form of evidence. It suggested that the narrative being repeated might not reflect the full reality of the situation. Over time, that quiet observation started weakening the rumor from within. Each day that passed without a dramatic reaction from you made the story feel less convincing. The absence of conflict removed the emotional excitement that often keeps gossip alive. Conversations about the situation began losing energy because there was no new drama to sustain them. People who had initially been curious about the rumor gradually moved on to other topics, leaving the narrative circulating only among those who remained emotionally invested in it. This natural fading process is one of the reasons silence can strengthen truth over time. When speculation no longer receives fresh fuel, it begins collapsing under its own lack of substance. Another important aspect of silence is the clarity it brings to the difference between those who seek truth and those who simply enjoy repeating stories. When you refrain from reacting immediately, people reveal their motivations through how they respond to the situation. Some individuals become curious and begin questioning the rumor more carefully because they recognize that something about the narrative feels incomplete. Others continue repeating the story without examining it because the excitement of gossip matters more to them than the accuracy of the information they share. Your silence allowed this distinction to emerge naturally. The environment itself began sorting people according to their willingness to think critically about what they heard. This process also created the conditions for the unexpected person who eventually spoke up on your behalf. Had the situation been dominated by loud arguments and constant rebuttals, that individual might have hesitated to enter the conversation. Confrontational environments often discourage thoughtful voices because people fear being pulled into emotional disputes. But the quiet space created by your restraint allowed someone with clearer insight into the situation to step forward when the time was right. Their explanation carried weight precisely because it did not appear as part of an ongoing argument. It sounded like a thoughtful observation emerging from a calm environment rather than a defensive counterattack against criticism. In this way, your silence acted like a stabilizing force that preserved the credibility of the truth until it was ready to surface. There is also a deeper psychological reason why silence can strengthen truth in situations involving rumors or misinterpretations. When people hear accusations followed by immediate defense, their minds often focus more on the emotional tension between the two sides than on the details of the situation itself. They become spectators of a conflict rather than thoughtful observers of the facts. Silence changes this dynamic by shifting attention away from emotional confrontation and toward personal reflection. Without constant argument to distract them, listeners begin evaluating the situation internally. They compare the rumor with what they know about your character, your past behavior, and the way you carry yourself in everyday life. If the rumor does not align with those observations, doubt begins forming naturally in their minds. This internal questioning is far more powerful than any defense you could have delivered publicly, because it arises from their own reasoning rather than from persuasion imposed by someone else. Another dimension of your silence lies in the message it sends about personal confidence. People who know they are standing within the truth often feel less urgency to defend themselves against every accusation. They understand that time will reveal inconsistencies and false narratives without requiring constant intervention. Your calm presence communicated that kind of confidence to those around you. Instead of appearing desperate to correct every misunderstanding, you appeared grounded in the knowledge that reality would eventually become visible on its own. This kind of confidence is rare, and when others witness it, they begin reconsidering the assumptions they previously accepted. They start asking themselves why someone who was supposedly guilty of the accusations would appear so composed and unaffected. That question alone can begin dismantling the rumor's credibility. Silence also has a strategic dimension that many people overlook. By refusing to engage in every conversation about your private life, you avoided the trap of giving the rumor additional exposure. Each time someone responds publicly to gossip, the topic receives renewed attention. People who had not previously heard about the situation suddenly become aware of it, and curiosity draws them into the narrative. Your decision not to amplify the conversation prevented that cycle from repeating endlessly. Instead of expanding outward through new audiences, the rumor remained confined within the circles where it originally emerged. Over time, those circles lost interest as the story failed to produce the dramatic conflict they expected. This quiet containment played an important role in allowing the truth to emerge later, without competing against a constantly expanding rumor. As the situation progressed, and someone eventually stepped forward to clarify what had really happened, the truth arrived in an environment that was already prepared to hear it. Your earlier silence had softened the ground for that moment. Listeners were no longer consumed by the excitement of speculation. They had already begun questioning the narrative on their own. When the accurate explanation finally appeared, it did not need to fight aggressively against entrenched beliefs. It simply filled the gaps that people had been wondering about. The story suddenly made sense in ways the rumor never fully did. Observers who had watched the entire situation unfold could now see how your silence had protected the integrity of the truth until it could be presented clearly. Looking back, it becomes clear that your restraint was not a passive response to the situation, but an active choice rooted in emotional strength and patience. You trusted that time, observation, and honesty would eventually reveal what speculation could not sustain. That trust allowed you to avoid unnecessary conflict while maintaining your dignity throughout the process. And now, as the truth begins reshaping how people understand the situation, the quiet power of that choice becomes visible to everyone who witnessed the journey from rumor to clarity. Why the X is reacting so strongly now begins with a moment that often confuses people on the outside of a situation like this. Because when the truth finally starts surfacing, observers frequently ask the same question: why does the person who helped create the rumor react so intensely once the narrative begins collapsing? On the surface, it might look irrational. After all, if someone has already told their version of the story, why would they feel the need to keep responding once the situation begins clarifying itself? But human psychology explains this reaction in ways that are both complex and deeply revealing. When a person has invested emotional energy into a particular narrative, that story becomes more than just a sequence of events. It becomes part of how they understand themselves. The version of events they told others allowed them to maintain a certain identity in the aftermath of the relationship. Perhaps that identity framed them as the misunderstood one, the injured one, or the one who was treated unfairly. Whatever the details were, that narrative created a psychological structure that protected their sense of dignity. Once that structure begins cracking under the weight of truth, the reaction can feel almost instinctive. The individual is not only defending a story anymore, they are defending the identity they built around that story. This is why their response now appears so intense. For a long time, the rumor circulated without much resistance. Conversations repeated the narrative comfortably, and every retelling reinforced the same interpretation of events. In that environment, the X had little reason to question whether their story would ever be challenged. Each conversation that echoed their perspective acted like confirmation that the narrative was working. The social environment around them validated the explanation they had offered, and that validation made the story feel secure. But the moment someone stepped forward and began correcting the narrative, the environment changed dramatically. The story that once moved smoothly through conversations now encountered questions. People who had previously accepted the explanation without hesitation started looking at the situation differently. Suddenly, the ex realized that the narrative they depended on was no longer protected by silence. And when that realization occurs, emotional reactions can become very strong, because the mind interprets the challenge as a threat to stability. Instead of seeing the correction as an opportunity to reconsider the past more honestly, the instinct may be to double down on the story that once provided comfort. That doubling down is what observers often describe as crashing out. The person reacts loudly, emotionally, and sometimes unpredictably, because they feel their control over the narrative slipping away. For someone who has relied on a particular version of events to explain a breakup or conflict, losing control of that narrative can feel like losing the ability to explain themselves entirely. This is why their responses may appear exaggerated or desperate. The intensity does not come from the present moment alone. It comes from the accumulated pressure of realizing that the explanation they shared with others may no longer hold together once people begin hearing the full truth. There is also another psychological layer involved in this reaction. When a rumor circulates about someone else, the person spreading it often believes that the target of the rumor will respond aggressively. They expect confrontation, denial, or attempts to disprove the story. Those reactions allow them to frame the conflict as a battle between two competing narratives, which keeps the focus on the argument itself rather than on the accuracy of the original claim. But when the person being discussed responds with silence and composure instead, the dynamic changes entirely. Without the anticipated confrontation, the rumor is left to stand on its own. Over time, people begin noticing that the story lacks reinforcement from real evidence. In your case, that quiet composure removed the drama that might have kept the rumor alive longer. Observers saw someone who did not appear frantic to defend themselves, and that alone started creating doubt about the original narrative. Now that the truth is beginning to surface more clearly through someone else's voice, the ex finds themselves facing a situation they did not anticipate. They expected a confrontation they could argue against. Instead, they are facing a slow shift in perception that they cannot easily control. That lack of control often triggers emotional reactions because it feels like the story is slipping away from them piece by piece. Another factor intensifying their response is the realization that social credibility works differently than they expected. When rumors spread, people initially assume that repetition equals validation. Hearing the same story from multiple voices creates the illusion that the information must be accurate. But once someone introduces a clearer explanation supported by context and observation, repetition loses its power. The story that once sounded convincing begins appearing exaggerated or incomplete. Listeners start comparing the emotional tone of the rumor with the calm clarity of the truth being shared. The contrast alone can make the rumor seem less reliable. As this shift unfolds, the ex may notice subtle changes in how others respond to them. Conversations that once supported their narrative may now include questions they cannot easily answer. Friends who once repeated the story may begin responding more cautiously. These subtle shifts signal that the social environment is changing, and those signals can intensify the emotional reaction further. It is important to understand that reactions like this often reveal more about unresolved emotions than about the situation itself. When someone has not fully processed the end of a relationship or conflict, they sometimes rely on storytelling to make sense of the experience. That story becomes the framework through which they explain everything that happened. But if the story was built on selective details rather than balanced understanding, it becomes fragile over time. When truth begins exposing the gaps within that framework, the emotional reaction reflects the discomfort of confronting those gaps. For observers, the intensity of the reaction may seem disproportionate to the moment, but internally the person feels as though their entire explanation of the past is being dismantled. Meanwhile, your position within this dynamic has remained remarkably steady. The same composure that allowed the rumor to weaken over time now allows the truth to emerge without confrontation. While the X reacts emotionally to the shifting narrative, you remain grounded in the reality of what actually occurred. That difference in response becomes increasingly visible to others watching the situation unfold. People naturally compare the behaviors they see. On one side, they witness emotional volatility and attempts to defend a narrative that no longer holds together smoothly. On the other side, they see calm consistency and the quiet confidence of someone who does not need to exaggerate events to explain them. This contrast alone often reshapes how the situation is understood. As the X continues reacting, each emotional outburst may inadvertently draw more attention to the fragility of the story they are trying to protect. Listeners who once accepted the narrative casually now start noticing how intensely it is being defended. That intensity raises new questions. If the story were truly as simple as it once sounded, why would it require so much emotional energy to maintain? Why would the person telling it react so strongly when others begin hearing different perspectives? These questions naturally guide people toward reconsidering what actually happened. And as they reconsider, the narrative that once supported the rumor begins losing its influence entirely. What remains visible in the end is the difference between someone trying to preserve a story and someone simply living within the truth of their own experience. How this moment quietly restores your reputation begins with something subtle but powerful that many people do not immediately notice when a rumor collapses and the truth begins circulating again. Reputation is rarely restored through loud announcements or dramatic declarations of innocence. Instead, it returns gradually through observation, through small shifts in perception, and through the quiet recognition that the story people once believed no longer fits the person they are watching. The process often unfolds so naturally that by the time individuals realize their opinion has changed, they can hardly remember the exact moment the shift began. In your situation, this moment has already started unfolding. The truth entering the conversation did more than correct a misunderstanding about your private life. It introduced clarity into a narrative that had been built largely on speculation. Once that clarity appeared, people began comparing the earlier story with the behavior they have consistently seen from you. That comparison slowly restores balance to the way they understand the situation. Reputation, after all, is not simply a collection of words people say about someone. It is a long-term impression shaped by actions, consistency, and character over time. When rumors attempt to redefine that impression, they can temporarily distort how others interpret a person's behavior. But distortion rarely survives prolonged observation. Over time, people notice patterns that contradict the narrative they once heard. They see how someone responds to challenges, how they interact with others, and how they carry themselves when facing misunderstandings. Those observations gradually become more convincing than any rumor that once circulated. In your case, the composure you maintained while the situation unfolded played a major role in this restoration. People remember how someone behaves under pressure far more clearly than they remember the details of gossip. When they look back on the period when the rumor circulated, they will recall that you did not react with chaos or aggression. Instead, you continued living your life calmly, allowing events to unfold without turning every misunderstanding into a public argument. That composure now becomes part of the story people tell themselves about what actually happened. Instead of remembering the rumor as proof of wrongdoing, they begin remembering your response as evidence of strength and confidence. This transformation in perception happens quietly, but it carries significant influence over how others view you moving forward. Another important aspect of reputation restoration lies in how conversations change once the truth becomes clearer. At first, people may feel hesitant to acknowledge that the rumor they heard was inaccurate. Admitting that they believed something misleading can feel uncomfortable. Yet as the accurate explanation continues circulating, they gradually adjust the way they speak about the situation. Instead of repeating the earlier narrative, they begin referencing the corrected version. They might say things like, "I think the story was misunderstood," or "There was more to that situation than people realized." These subtle changes in language signal that the social environment surrounding your name is shifting. The rumor that once traveled freely through conversation begins disappearing because people no longer feel confident repeating it. Over time, the narrative fades from everyday discussion altogether, replaced by a more balanced understanding of who you are and how the situation actually unfolded. What remains after that process is something far stronger than the reputation that existed before the rumor began. People who witnessed the entire journey now see evidence of resilience in your character. They saw how you handled misunderstanding without becoming consumed by it. They observed how truth eventually emerged without you needing to force it into the conversation. That experience changes how they interpret future interactions with you. Instead of relying on hearsay, they trust their own observations more carefully. This trust becomes the foundation for a reputation built not on gossip, but on demonstrated character. In many ways, the moment you are living through now represents the closing chapter of a cycle that began when the rumor first appeared. At the beginning, the narrative about your private life moved quickly because it carried emotional excitement. People repeated it because it sounded dramatic and because no one had yet introduced a clearer explanation. But as time passed, that excitement faded. Silence allowed inconsistencies to surface. Observation created doubt. And eventually, someone spoke the truth that reorganized the entire story. Now the environment has shifted completely. The same conversations that once spread speculation are beginning to carry clarity instead. Your reputation is being restored not through confrontation, but through recognition. Those who once believed the rumor are quietly adjusting their understanding. Those who doubted the narrative from the beginning feel confirmed in their instincts. And those who are only now learning the full story see a person who remained grounded even when others tried to define them through misunderstanding. This restoration is not loud, but it is lasting. It grows stronger each time someone chooses observation over assumption. Each time someone remembers your composure instead of the rumor that once surrounded you. And each time the truth continues spreading naturally through the conversations that once carried speculation. How this entire situation reveals your strength begins with the realization that moments like this are rarely just about rumors, misunderstandings, or the behavior of other people. At a deeper level, they become quiet tests of character that reveal how someone responds when their name is placed inside a narrative they did not create. Anyone can appear confident and composed when circumstances are easy and when their reputation remains untouched. But the real measure of inner strength appears during the periods when the environment around them becomes clouded by speculation, misinterpretation, and emotional noise. The situation you moved through was one of those moments. What initially appeared to be an uncomfortable disruption in your life slowly transformed into a demonstration of patience, emotional discipline, and self-trust. Instead of allowing the rumor to define your behavior, you allowed time to reveal the weakness within it. Instead of chasing every conversation to defend yourself, you continued living in a way that quietly contradicted the narrative being repeated about you. And instead of reacting impulsively to those who misunderstood your situation, you trusted that truth has a natural ability to surface when people begin observing reality more carefully. That trust proved to be one of the most powerful decisions you could have made. Over time, silence allowed inconsistencies in the rumor to appear. Observation encouraged others to question what they had heard. And eventually, the truth entered the conversation through someone willing to speak honestly. What makes this entire journey meaningful is not simply that the rumor faded, or that the narrative surrounding your life began correcting itself. The deeper significance lies in how you carried yourself throughout the process. Every moment of restraint, every decision not to escalate conflict, and every choice to remain grounded contributed to the outcome people are witnessing now. Those who once heard the rumor are now seeing something different. A person who did not crumble under misunderstanding, who did not become bitter or chaotic in response to gossip, and who allowed integrity to speak louder than explanation. That kind of strength leaves a lasting impression because it cannot be fabricated. In the end, situations like this reveal an important truth about life and human relationships. False narratives may travel quickly through conversation, but they rarely survive long in the presence of consistent character and quiet resilience. What ultimately remains is not the rumor that once circulated, but the example of how someone handled it. And as people look back on this moment, the lasting story will not be the speculation that once surrounded your name. It will be the calm, steady way you stood in the truth, while everything else slowly corrected itself around you.